So hello, my name is Kathryn Szoka. I'm a photographer, primarily of communities in transition. Over the course of my photographic career, I often concentrate on subjects that are overlooked and undervalued or underappreciated, let's say, by the general audience. So starting early in the mid-'80s, I documented the vanishing landscapes of the East End, which was a way of basically acknowledging the farming heritage that the East End had been engaged in for over a century. And I called the series Vanishing Landscapes, and it did concentrate primarily on the farms, the barns, and the worked agricultural landscape of the East End. In terms of my landscape work, after a while, I became aware that all of the landscape that was being developed was actually already zoned to be developed in a different way, to become suburban housing developments. And so in a way my art led to my activism, because at that point I became a very ardent activist for the environment. Moving away from, still staying with the landscape motif, over time I've tried many different ways to show my, to find a visually compelling way to express my concern about now not only just the environment changing, but also the changes that were happening in the broader culture sociologically, in terms of the vast differences of wealth in the East End where we live. And through those concerns, which I was very much involved with from a political point of view, I wanted to find an aesthetic way to kind of bring that point home. I have done a lot of before and after essays showing what the landscape looked like, let's say in the mid to late '80s, and what it looks like today, which helps to really draw that point home. But it was really my Witness series, basically photographing the wrapped shrubbery out here, which became like the perfect metaphor for what was happening in our culture in terms of the overdevelopment, in terms of the economic disparities, in terms of the immigration issues. So that became a pivot point for me. Moving away from my landscapes, I've also done portrait studies. In terms of overlooked communities, I have been documenting my away from this area, my mother's hometown in eastern Pennsylvania, the coal mining region, with a series called Black and Green, which is really a coal town struggling to hold on in the face of many changes and many challenges. Locally here on the East End, over about a decade plus, maybe 12 years ago, I spent several years documenting the African American community in Bridgehampton in a series called Life Along the Turnpike, in a way to give a visual dignity to the people who came to the area, their ancestors who came to the area to actually work in the farming fields, and who settled here and now have a very vibrant community in Bridgehampton, a community that was often overlooked and actually driven by. What I'd like to also say to kind of put a button on that last segment, though, is that I documented the last year of my father's life pictorially, and in a series called Crooked Knee. And the reason why I bring that up is because that's yet another overlooked aspect of our culture, where elderly people are, and that time of death, that last year or two, many people don't want to see. So that it was important for me to bring that out. So I just wanted to bring that up in terms of a broader view of the work. What inspires me to create? Photography has always been an obsession with me. It's just been something that I have always been drawn to, the camera, as a way of kind of like making sense of the world. Even before I was doing professional photography work, it was my medium for communicating, and to a large extent. And so what inspires me to use the camera is, I think, something ineffable within me that I think all artists feel, that just has this, it's like that little mustard seed, but it has to burst forward and out into the world in order for me as a person to be able to make sense of who I am and what the world is like around me. So that's from within, but from without, what inspires me to create in terms of my landscape work, I would say, is just the exquisite beauty of the light. We're really blessed and graced to live in an area which has not only beautiful landscape but also wonderful light. I'm sure all the artists have talked to you about the reflected light from the water, as a special, and the vapor in the atmosphere adds a special quality to the light. And I'd also like to say at this point, in terms of my own, I get educated every time I pick up the camera, and every time I show my work, and every time somebody talks to me about my work, and every time I encounter someone who has lived in this land. And it took me a long time, and it's only been within the last decade that I have grown to appreciate the fact that I really live on indigenous land. I live on land that has been cared for thousands of years by the Shinnecock and the Montaukett nations. And I am just, such a recent arrival. And the reason I was able to capture with my camera a lot of the landscape, which I did in the 80s and the 90s, is because they were such good stewards of this land. And I think I just have to have a land acknowledgement of any time I talk about my work as a landscape photographer. So getting back to what inspires me, of course, in addition to that, in addition to the light, and when I say light, it's not just the beautiful sunlight, because we have these fantastically foggy days that are so very atmospheric and able to really show a depth of emotion and expression that is wonderful for a photographer. There's been when you think of a photographer, you think, oh well, a camera and a dark room, or Photoshop on your screen. But really, there's been a tremendous amount of changes in the technology of photography over the course of my career. When I first started, I had no concept or no knowledge that within 2 decades, instead of working, with 35 millimeter film, I would be doing, and in a dark room with a red light, I would be doing work in bright sunlight in on an IMAX screen. So, I would like to say that my work has many threads, and one thread, especially with the Vanishing landscapes, has been to, at least initially, to use the more traditional color darkroom techniques, just a C41 process. But I also, in an effort to make the images go a step beyond photography, I early on became really captivated by the Polaroid transfer technique, which allows you to create a photographic image that actually looks like a watercolor. And I just am bringing 2 examples here to show you. One series I did on farm tools and old rusty objects, which I still love very much. And here's another one. And this is a series that I did of people in rural Maine. Again, another community that's not well documented. So the Polaroid transfer technology and technique was really something I threw myself wholeheartedly into, so much so that Polaroid contacted me, and I worked together with them for several years on helping to promote the use of the Polaroid transfers. In addition, so that was probably, I would say, in the 90s, and then the digital world just exploded. I was kind of a latecomer in a way. I mean, I was using digital technology from early on, but I did feel that the quality of the prints that it produced was very poor in comparison to what you could still get with the traditional techniques. And so I often worked with, I often worked with the 35 millimeter camera, but I also, when I was working with the Bridgehampton project, which was in the late 2008, 2010, I used a 2.25 camera. I used a Bronica, which is like a Hasselblad film camera, to create the portraits. And so this is an example of some of the work that came out of that project. This is Marion Darden, who lives on the Turnpike. This is Jaden at the Child Care Center. And this is Father Frank Bryant doing a home visit with deacons to someone who was not well. So I mentioned the Turnpike series in conjunction with this because that was kind of like the pivot point. At that point, I turned from doing things exclusively with film to doing a hybrid approach. So I used a 35mm digital camera to photograph in a lot of active environments. And then I used the Bronica, the 2¼ camera, to capture more thoughtful portraits of the individuals. And since then the technology has obviously evolved tremendously. And while I still shoot 2¼ I am primarily shooting digitally, and I do use a lot of post-processing software to try to again take the image beyond the traditional photograph to something that is, if not like a watercolor, a little more artistic, or just outside the realm of how somebody would naturally look at it. So this is one example of of using digital technology, but with additional post-processing tools to allow the photograph to sort of spring forward from what it would look like if it was a straight color photograph to create a mood which conveys, I think, effectively the emotion of what I'm trying to present in terms of the landscape. This one, I believe, is called Refugees. And this is just one other example. Some art works better in black and white, and some works better in color, and that's just part of the overall process as I work with the art to determine which I prefer. So the natural environment, I think, influences all artists here. So and I think it's what drew artists here. I mean, we know Pollock, before Pollock, William Merritt Chase. I mean, why were they here? They were here because the environment is so breathtakingly beautiful. And even when I'm involved in doing portrait work, I mean, the environment is a big part of that work. So let me talk a little bit about my experiences with the landscape, especially when I do go out to photograph the landscape. There is something very special about slowing down, kind of being in the moment, knowing a location that you really like, and it's like, there's something special here. There's some sort of little secret here, and so I have this compulsion, this desire to kind of find out what is that secret, what is that special mood that in my mind I see when I look at this. How can I translate that now onto film or onto the digital sensor in my camera? And so that kind of captures what's going on when I approach and first start in a scene. But to just be out in nature, without the cell phone, without any distractions, and just having it come directly, having it surround me, having it embrace me, is a comforting feeling. There's a spiritual aspect to it. There's an awe of being, a very small little blade of grass in this big field of what, the god and the goddess has created. And so I would say that I probably wouldn't be a photographer if it wasn't for the love of the landscape, because that was my gateway, that was my open door that led me to what I do photographically. I'd also like to acknowledge that in addition to the light, one special landscape, which sadly we don't see as much any longer, is a snowstorm. I like nothing better than when, the land is coated with snow, to either get in my truck and go someplace and photograph, or just get out, and walk around where I live and take some photographs. There's something transformative about snow that I find cleansing, that I find just really, again, ineffable comes to mind. It's hard for me to describe the feeling of the quiet that kind of overwhelms the landscape at that point, and just the walking, the one footfall after another, almost silent in the snow. And so this particular image is something that just is a very ordinary sort of backyard image that I was able to, walking around the neighborhood, find. So I just want to, praise the snow and what it does to the landscape, and what it does to each of us. I think it brings out the kid in each of us, or it has the potential to bring out the kid in each of us, as long as we don't have to get behind the wheel. So that's just one example. I mean, a bank of fog also is a wonderful thing to see. And I will hop out of bed early in the morning if I think it's going to be foggy, and hit the road to go to a particular location where I think fog will be evident, not unlike this particular piece here. Community is critically important to me, and every year I have become more and more aware of the importance of that. I moved to Sag Harbor in the early 90s. I had been living over in the North Sea area, and again immediately fell in love with Sag Harbor. I mean, Sag Harbor at that point was very much the village it was at the end of the Depression almost. I mean, it was the Unhampton. It's maybe hard for people to actually remember that that's what it was called up until about 10 years ago, but it was the antithesis to the glitz and the glamour that is what's portrayed as the Hamptons. And I will say emphatically that I do not like to call the area that I live in the Hamptons. I live on the east end of Long Island. The Hamptons is again a fictive location that was developed by the real estate industry, and to my senses, it's done a lot of. It hasn't been to the benefit of the area to a large extent, but that's a discussion for another day, perhaps. But Sag Harbor was, to me, the town where, people, many artists lived here, many writers lived here. We're sitting in Canio's Books right now, which I'm a co-owner of, and is been involved as sort of like a community gathering spot for artists, writers, and others since 1980. So it's quite an accomplishment that the store has been here that long. My partner Marianne Coundrell and myself have been owners since 1999. So that's a big chunk of time. And between my artwork, between being here at the store, and between my activism work, they've all connected together to inform me, to educate me about how important community really is. And one essay that I didn't mention that Marianne and I were involved with earlier on, or actually two, we photographed a lot of the older people who live in Sag Harbor. This is going back to the 90s, and we had a column in the Southampton Press where she would write about the individual and I would photograph them. Again, people that, overlooked by the broader glamour of the area, but who were the salt and pepper well, the community is extremely important to me, and it's something that I've really grown to appreciate. I could say as a younger person, it maybe wasn't something I was as aware of. But since moving to Sag Harbor in the early 90s, I discovered how important it was to have a community of artists, of writers, of athletes, of carpenters, of people that just were able to very naturally interact with each other, and that has a lot to do with the built environment of Sag Harbor, how everything, as one writer put it, all the roads lead in a web-like fashion down to the center, down to Long Wharf, and it's easy for you to see a friend and every day of the week if you just go to buy a grocery or, to get a coffee. And so living in Sag Harbor raised my awareness of how important community was. Being here in the bookstore at Canio's Books, where we're recording, has been another incredibly valuable education about community. Both my art and my involvement here led or fostered my community activism, which is another prong of who I am, and all of them are sort of threaded together in a way that each nurtures the other. And so, community is critically important. And I think art is, some people say, well, is it activism? Is it art? What is the how do you balance them out? And, having a great deal of involvement in activism, and in art, I can see that art really allows people to transform their vision of the world without feeling in any way threatened by it. It opens up. I think that, art increases our imagination, the ability to view art, to contemplate art, and it allows us to get out of like an either or this or that kind of a point of view. And that's, I think, the value that artists really bring to the world, especially today when there seems to be so much noise and so much contention. Art gives us an opportunity to kind of slow down, to reflect on at our own speed, what maybe an image, a photograph, a painting, a sculpture is trying to convey. And in that act, it's an active engagement that the viewer has with artwork. It's not passive like watching TV or maybe just reading something on the internet. It's you actively perceive something, and it offers an opportunity for some transformation of thought. And so I think that that's an important aspect that art provides to community, and everything kind of feeds together in a healthy and productive way. It's interesting to contemplate the idea of what is, sort of success for artwork. In a way, I feel like success in art, shouldn't be even considered in the same breath. I mean, I think artists work because there's a compulsion to work. They can't stop it. However, of course, we all are human, and we'd like to be able to have the work acknowledged by others in some fashion. So for me, I feel that my work is successful if I've communicated something and transformed the person in some way. Early on, when I did a lot of the landscape work, people would often come up and say, I've driven by that barn every day on my way to work, but I never really saw it. And so I was gratified to hear them acknowledge that the photograph allowed them to see something in a new way, it maybe more deeply than they had themselves in their own day-to-day activities of life. So I think that for me, success is having the work be seen by other people, and then having those people be affected and transformed in some meaningful way. Early on in my photographic career, I started to show at the Robin Rice Gallery in New York City. And Robin was one of the first people to really look at my work and acknowledge its quality, and to show it in her gallery. So I'm very grateful for her. She has also had a very long run as a gallery owner. She's in the city. She was in Beacon and had to move out because of a flood, and now she's looking for another place. But that engagement was also instrumental to my work. I want to also just very briefly emphasize the importance of teaching photography to my own creation of photography. I learn a tremendous amount when I work with students. They all bring a wonderful and unique point of view to the way they look at the world, and I learn from them, and because I need to teach them, I have to continually educate myself about all aspects of photography, from technical aspects to aesthetic aspects, to really understanding the tradition of which, you know, my feet fall into, from photographers going back to the early days to photographers who are photographing now. And it's been wonderful, especially at this sort of very vital time of our life, to be able to bring to other, you know, photographers and other people the work of photographers who have not received much acknowledgement previously. Just like my own work tries to elevate communities that have been potentially overlooked, I have thoroughly enjoyed engaging with students to tell them about photographers who may have not had much of an opportunity to get that acknowledgement. We live in a time, in a very multicultural time. It's a wonderful moment. I feel graced and blessed to have been photographing the African American community in Bridgehampton, recognizing, you know, from the beginning that I was, in essence, an intruder as a white person, not living there, though I was friends with many in the environment because of many different connections, you know, one including my love of basketball, and having played for the University of Maryland, I was a big supporter of the Bridgehampton Killer Bees from the start. But I just wanted to acknowledge the fact that everyone brings their own point of view to what they photograph, and if you are an outsider, you can't necessarily bring the point of view of somebody who was within the community. However, I try to work with respect and to present the people there with the dignity that was just inherent in their everyday activity. And so I just wanted to, you know, bring that out, because we live at a time when these conversations are important, and they're finally getting out there, and I welcome them.